courtroom in downtown Cleveland was dead silent. For exactly 20 years, Raymond Vance had lived inside a 6x9 concrete cell, waiting for this exact day. Freedom was close enough to touch. Then, the presiding judge, Supreme Court Justice Arthur Pendelton, reached forward to turn a page. His silk sleeve slipped back, exposing his bare left wrist. Raymond Vance looked up. In that single frozen microsecond, the blood instantly drained from his face.
Take me back to the cell! I don't want to appeal!
He stood up so fast his chair flipped backward. Shouting at the top of his lungs, he told the court to stop. He withdrew his appeal, declared he was guilty, gasped, and begged the bailiffs to drag him back to his cell. Why would a man fight for his innocence for half his life, only to throw it away in 4 seconds? The jury thought he had gone mad, but Raymond wasn't crazy. He was terrified, because the monster he had been hunting for 20 years was sitting directly above him, holding the gavel. Paused to understand the dark secret hidden on that judge's wrist. We have to travel back in time to a freezing, rain-slicked night in November of 2006. To truly understand the sheer paralyzing horror of what Raymond Vance saw on that judicial wrist, we have to travel back in time. We have to look at the anatomy of a tragedy that began on a freezing rain-slicked night in November of 2006. Back then, Raymond was just an ordinary 25-year-old factory worker, a young man with big dreams but limited means, walking home after a brutal 12-hour shift along a dimly lit industrial avenue in the outskirts of the city. He had his headphones in, his head down against the biting wind and the freezing rain, thinking only of the warm soup waiting for him in his small apartment. He had no idea that just 3 blocks away, a nightmare was unfolding. A masked gunman had just breached the reinforced back door of a high-end precious metals warehouse. The robbery had been planned for months. It was being carried out with a terrifying clinical precision that suggested the thief knew the internal security schedules, the blind spots of the cameras, and the exact location of the heavy gold bullion vaults. Visual inside the warehouse, a flash of a heavy metal flashlight cuts through the dark. An elderly security guard walks slowly. Suddenly, a masked figure emerges from the dark, raises a pistol, and a muzzle flash lights up the screen. The guard collapses VO. But human plans are inherently fragile, and the universe has a cruel way of introducing variables. Things went horribly wrong when the elderly night watchman, a man named Thomas Miller, who wasn't even supposed to be on shift that night, stumbled into the main loading floor, holding a heavy metal flashlight. He had heard a strange scraping sound near the vaults. The gunman, startled by the sudden light, didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He raised a heavy-caliber pistol and fired a single cold-blooded shot directly into the old man's chest. The watchman collapsed onto the concrete floor, the flashlight rolling away and casting long, erratic shadows across the stolen gold. The killer panicked. He grabbed a heavy canvas bag of bullion, abandoning the rest of the plan, and sprinted toward the emergency exit that led into the dark alleyway. Visual Raymond is walking in the rain, turning a corner. Suddenly, the masked killer bursts out of a metal door, colliding heavily with Raymond. They roll on the wet pavement. Raymond desperately grabs the killer's left wrist, under the beam of a bright, flickering street lamp. The sleeve pulls back to reveal a horrific, glowing, cross-shaped chemical burn scar. Raymond happened to turn the dark corner into that exact warehouse alleyway. At the exact moment the metal exit doors flew open, the masked killer came flying out into the driving rain and collided heavily with Raymond. The impact was massive, sending both men tumbling onto the wet, slick concrete, surrounded by the trash and debris of the industrial park. In the frantic, desperate scramble that followed, Raymond's survival instincts kicked in. He didn't know who the man was, but he saw the ski mask, he smelled the metallic scent of fresh gunpowder, and he knew something was deeply wrong. He lunged forward, grabbing the killer's left arm with all his strength, trying to pin him to the ground until help could arrive. For a brief, agonizing split second, the two men wrestled violently on the wet concrete under the harsh, flickering beam of a rusted street lamp. Visual close-up on the struggle. The killer's sleeve is pulled back by a sharp metal watch buckle. Under the amber street lamp, the white, jagged, raised cross-shaped scar on the skin is shown in sharp, disturbing focus. VO. As the killer pulled his arm back to strike Raymond with the butt of the heavy pistol, his thick jacket sleeve caught on the metal buckle of Raymond's wristwatch. The sleeve pulled back several inches, exposing the bare flesh of his arm. Raymond didn't see the man's face behind the thick black fabric of the ski mask, but his eyes burned an unforgettable, terrifying detail into his memory. Etched deep into the flesh of the killer's left wrist was a horrific, raised, white scar shaped exactly like a distorted cross, the unmistakable jagged mark of an old, severe chemical acid burn. It was a distinctive, uneven deformity with thick keloid tissue that form a violent intersection near the base of the thumb. The killer landed a brutal, crushing blow to Raymond's ribs, breaking the young man's grip, and vanished into the foggy, rain-swept darkness of the industrial park, leaving the canvas bag behind. Visual, the killer kicks Raymond away and flees into the darkness. Red and blue police lights instantly flash across Raymond's wet face as he sits dazed on the ground. Cut to a fast montage of an old courtroom, a gavel slamming, and a young Raymond being led away in handcuffs. Minutes later, the alleyway was swarming with flashing red and blue lights, sirens wailing against the concrete walls. The police found Raymond shivering on the ground, gasping for air from his broken ribs, covered in the mud of the alley, and bearing the victim's blood on his jacket from the frantic collision with the fleeing killer. To the responding detectives, the case was instantly solved. They didn't look any further. They arrested Raymond on the spot, ignoring his heavy wheezing and his desperate attempts to point down the dark street where the real killer had run. The lead investigator was a cynical veteran who was buried under a mountain of unsolved homicides and wanted a quick, high-profile closure to satisfy the local media. He completely dismissed Raymond's frantic, screaming descriptions of the masked man with the chemical cross on his wrist. VO. The detective told him that every criminal has a story, and that his story was pathetic. In fact, during the official processing and transcription of the interrogation, the police logs miraculously lost the page, detailing Raymond's initial statement about the attacker's physical deformity. The prosecution painted Raymond as a greedy, desperate young factory worker who had lost his mind, attempted to rob the warehouse, and killed a defenseless elder when the plan went wrong. The state-appointed defense lawyer was overworked, handling 40 other cases, and didn't bother to investigate the missing pages of the police report. A rushed, highly circumstantial 2-day trial followed in a city desperate for answers. The jury bought the narrative, convicted Raymond of first-degree murder, and sentenced him to life without the absolute possibility of parole. Visual cut back to the present-day prison, a montage of Raymond in a tiny cell surrounding himself with hundreds of legal books, handwriting notes on yellow legal pads, pinning newspaper, clippings of unsolved crimes to his concrete wall. VO inside the maximum security facility, Raymond refused to let his mind rot or succumb to the institutional despair that destroyed so many men around him. He realized early on that if he allowed himself to become bitter, the walls would win. He used his isolation to transform his life. He requested every legal text allowed by the prison library, turning his tiny, claustrophobic cell into a makeshift intelligence bureau and a sanctuary of legal knowledge. He spent years memorizing thousands of pages of case law, learning the delicate mechanics, the loopholes, and the structural failures of the very system that had crushed him. He became a legendary jailhouse lawyer, helping dozens of other inmates draft successful petitions and motions. But he wasn't just studying to be a legal scholar. He was hunting a ghost. Visual close-up on an old notebook page being flipped. The camera cuts between names, dates, and locations written in tight, obsessive cursive. A map of the tri-state area is pinned up with red, strings tracing violent crimes. Using old newspapers smuggled into the facility public records, requested through the Freedom of Information Act, and tips from inmates transferring in from other facilities across the state. Raymond kept a highly detailed, secret, handwritten journal hidden beneath his mattress. It was a comprehensive alphabetical catalog of every known criminal, suspect, gang member, and lowlife in the entire tri-state area who possessed any kind of burn scar or distinctive mark on their left arm. For 20 long years, that list grew to over 300 names. He investigated every single one of them through correspondence and legal proxies, spending his meager prison wages on postage stamps and public record fees. He tracked down cell house rumors, questioned former cellmates of arsonists, and mapped out the movements of every violent criminal with a history of handling chemicals. But every single lead resulted in a bitter, devastating dead end. The man with the chemical cross seemed to have completely vanished from the face of the earth on the exact night of the murder. A visual transition contrasting a dark prison cell with a luxurious legal office. We see Arthur Pendelton progressing through time, graduating from law school, standing in front of political banners, and finally putting on a prestigious judicial robe. He looks impeccably clean and wealthy. V.O. What Raymond could never have guessed in his wildest nightmares was the reason why the killer had disappeared from the criminal underworld. The man hadn't fled to another country, and he hadn't died in a prison brawl elsewhere. Instead, he had taken the massive, untraceable wealth from that stolen warehouse bullion, wealth that he had hidden safely before his encounter with Raymond, and used it to completely scrub his digital background clean. He changed his name legally through a corrupt offshore network, fabricated a flawless academic pedigree, and bought his way into a prestigious top-tier Ivy League law school. The killer had realized a profound truth about society. The safest place for a monster to hide was not in the shadows of the streets, but inside the very castle designed to protect the innocent. V.O. Arthur Pendleton climbed the political and judicial ladder with an astonishing, almost unnatural speed that left his peers in awe. He became a ruthless, media-savvy prosecutor who bragged about his 100% conviction rate, then a superior court judge, and finally a Supreme Court justice. By 2026, he was celebrated as a pillar of the conservative legal community, a harsh, uncompromising, legal purist known for handing down the maximum possible sentences to violent offenders. He was a master of public camouflage, hiding a dark, blood-stained past beneath the pristine, white-trimmed edges of a judicial robe. He was a man who spoke eloquently about the sanctity of the law, while knowing that his entire career was built on the bones of a dead watchman and the stolen life of an innocent young factory worker. Visual slow-motion replay of the courtroom scene from Part 1. The judge's sleeve falls back, showing the cross scar. Raymond is sitting in his cell now, head in his hands sweating as he realizes the sheer danger he is in. The camera zooms in on the terrifying realization on his face. V.O. When Raymond stood in that appellate courtroom 20 years later and watched Justice Pendleton's sleeve pull back, the illusion was shattered in a flash of pure, unadulterated horror. There it was, the exact same raised, jagged, cross-shaped acid scar sitting just inches away from the gold-trimmed mahogany gavel. In that 4-second freeze, Raymond's brilliant legal mind didn't think about justice. It thought about survival. He understood the brutal, terrifying reality of his situation with absolute clarity. If he pushed forward with his appeal, if he pointed his finger at the judge right there, in front of the live streaming cameras, he would never survive the transport van ride back to the facility. A Supreme Court justice with that level of absolute institutional power could destroy him with a single whisper to the right people. VO, Pendelton could easily order a corrupt transport guard to stage a fatal escape attempt on the dark highway or arrange for a violent gang-affiliated inmate to silence Raymond permanently during a staged power outage in the cell block. To survive, Raymond needed to deploy the ultimate legal strategy. He needed to retreat. He needed to make the judge believe that he was completely broken, terrified, and utterly defeated. By withdrawing the appeal and declaring his own guilt, Raymond was giving the judge a false sense of absolute victory. He was telling Pendelton that his secret was safe, that the system had won, and that there was no need to eliminate him. It was a desperate game of chess where Raymond had to sacrifice his immediate freedom just to keep his chest moving. Visual Raymond is seen talking into a heavily scratched prison payphone. On the other side of the split screen, a determined young female federal investigator, Sarah Vance, is sitting in a high-tech office surrounded by computer screens, taking notes frantically. VO, back inside the crushing, familiar isolation of his prison cell, Raymond did not waste a single second grieving his lost opportunity or crying over the bitter irony of his fate. He knew that the traditional legal channels were completely compromised. You cannot ask a corrupt court to investigate its own king. He sat on his metal bunk, his mind racing through every constitutional amendment, every federal statute, and every jurisdictional boundary. He waited patiently for his one allowed weekly phone call to the outside world, but he didn't call his defense lawyer, who was still furious and confused by Raymond's sudden courtroom breakdown. Instead, Raymond dialed a direct encrypted line to a young, independent federal investigator named Sarah Vance, a woman known in the Bureau for her relentless, uncompromising pursuit of white-collar crime and high-level judicial corruption. Sarah had been quietly investigating suspicious anonymous campaign donations linked to Justice Pendelton's historic rise, but she lacked the one thing required to bring down a giant, hard, undeniable evidence of criminal conduct. VO. When Raymond laid out the puzzle pieces over the scratchy prison phone, his voice steady and precise, explaining that the man who had signed his cell door shut was the very man who committed the warehouse murder in 2006. Sarah's hands stopped writing. The room went cold. She realized that she wasn't just dealing with a corruption case. She was looking at a historical horror story. But Sarah also knew the brutal reality of the federal court system. A 20-year-old visual memory of a scar from a convicted felon would never stand up against a supreme jurist. The media would paint Raymond as a desperate liar, trying to defame an American hero. They needed something modern. They needed something undeniable. They needed a direct, recorded confession from the mouth of Arthur Pendelton himself. Working together in total, agonizing secrecy, Raymond and Sarah orchestrated a highly dangerous, psychological trap that required flawless execution. Visual, an anonymous hand uploads a digital document to a glowing legal blog screen with the headline, 2006 Police Evidence Uncovered. Cut to Judge Pendelton sitting in his dark, luxury office, staring at his computer screen, his eyes widen in panic, his hand tightly gripping his left wrist. Sarah used a secure, anonymous network to leak a carefully fabricated rumor to a prominent local legal blog that she knew Pendelton monitored daily. The article, written by an investigative journalist friend, hinted that a federal archive facility in Chicago had just uncovered a misfiled, long-lost box of police evidence from the 2006 warehouse robbery, including an old, uncompressed audio tape containing the initial, unedited statement of the eyewitness, describing an attacker with an acid burn on his left wrist, along with a partial DNA profile retrieved from the canvas bag that had never been entered into the old database. The bait was laid, and it worked with terrifying efficiency. Panic began to slowly, invisibly unravel Judge Pendelton's cold, calculated exterior, sitting in his high-end judicial chambers. Staring at the glowing screen, the weight of 20 years of lies suddenly crashed down upon his shoulders. He realized that his entire empire, his status, his supreme seat, and his life were dangling by a single thread. He knew that as long as Raymond Vance was alive inside that maximum security facility, the ghost of his past could find a way out through federal investigators. He had to act, and he had to act immediately. 3 nights later, exploiting his absolute judicial privileges and using his emergency security clearance to bypass standard prison logging, visitor registration, and electronic weapon screening protocols, Justice Pendelton arrived at the maximum security facility dead after midnight. He demanded an immediate private, unmonitored meeting with inmate Raymond Vance in the deep isolation wing, claiming it was an urgent matter of state security regarding an ongoing appellate review. He wanted to look the only witness alive in the eye, gauge his compliance, and ensure the man understood the ultimate cost of opening his mouth to the feds. Visual: a dim, windowless concrete interrogation room. A single harsh light hangs over a metal table. Judge Pendelton stands tall over a seated Raymond. Pendelton slams his left hand flat on the table, aggressively baring the cross-shaped scar under the bright light. He speaks with a sinister, arrogant smile. The heavy steel door of the isolation room clicked shut with a sound that felt like a coffin closing, leaving the 2 lifelong adversaries entirely alone in the dim, windowless, concrete space. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and ancient fear. Justice Pendelton stood tall over the seated prisoner, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance and chilling malice. He didn't see a threat in Raymond. He saw a bug beneath his expensive, custom leather shoes. He leaned down over the small metal table, slamming his left hand flat onto the surface directly under the harsh glare of the single hanging light bulb. He deliberately pulled back his sleeve, letting the jagged, white, cross-shaped chemical scar glint under the light like a trophy of his survival. He leaned close, his breath hot against Raymond's face, his voice dripping with venomous confidence. He told Raymond that he had made the smartest decision of his pathetic, miserable life by dropping that appeal in the courtroom. He openly boasted about how he had built an untouchable empire out of a single night's work 20 years ago, mockingly reminding Raymond that the world would never take the word of a caged animal, a convicted murderer, over the absolute authority, the pristine reputation, of a Supreme Court justice. He told Raymond that he would rot in this concrete box until his hair turned white and his teeth fell out, and that there was absolutely nothing he could ever do to change the architecture of his destiny. Visual close-up of Raymond's calm, unblinking eyes. The camera slowly pans down beneath the metal table, tracking a tiny, hidden microphone wire taped inside a rusted ventilation shaft on the wall. A red recording light is slowly blinking. Raymond sat perfectly still, his hands folded loosely in his lap, his back straight, against the cold metal chair. His face was an unreadable mask of absolute calm, an island of serenity as he absorbed every single word of the judge's arrogant taunt. He didn't flinch, he didn't yell, and he didn't show a single ounce of the terror that Pendelton expected. Instead, he looked up into the dark, hollow eyes of the man who had stolen his entire youth, his 20s, his 30s, and his family. He asked Pendelton a single, quiet, devastating question. He asked him if he ever felt a single ounce of regret, or if he had ever lost a single night of sleep over the elderly knight, watchman Thomas Miller, whom he had shot in the chest in that dark alleyway, just for holding a flashlight. Pendleton let out a cold, hollow laugh that bounced off the wet concrete walls of the cell. He shook his head with genuine amusement, stating that the old watchman was nothing more than an uneducated, low-wage piece of collateral damage who made the foolish, fatal mistake of standing in the way of a brilliant man's progress. He said that some lives are meant to be fuel for greatness, and that Raymond's life was just the price of his seat on the Supreme Bench. Visual, the heavy metal door is violently thrown open. A team of tactical federal marshals with FBI and marshal jackets burst in with guns drawn. Pendleton's smile instantly vanishes. They push him against the wall and click steel handcuffs right over his chemical scar. Raymond slowly smiles, VO, the second those monstrous words left the judge's lips. Raymond reached beneath the rusted metal table and flipped a tiny microscopic toggle switch attached to a high-powered military-grade digital audio transmitter that Sarah had covertly installed inside the room's rusted ventilation shaft earlier that afternoon during a staged facility maintenance sweep. Outside the thick, reinforced walls of the penitentiary, sitting inside a dark, unmarked surveillance van, parked half a mile away, a team of federal agents, Sarah Vance, and a federal magistrate listened in absolute horror to the crystal clear, live-streamed audio of a Supreme Court justice explicitly confessing to an armed robbery, judicial cover-up, and cold-blooded first-degree murder. The trap had sprung, and the confession was permanent. The heavy steel door didn't just open. It was violently thrown off its latches as a tactical team of federal marshals and FBI agents burst into the room with tactical shields and weapons drawn, their laser sights cutting through the dim light. Justice Arthur, Pendleton's arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a pale, hollow mask of absolute, paralyzing shock as he was shoved face-first against the concrete wall, his expensive suit dragging against the grime. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists, locking directly over the cross-shaped chemical scar. He had spent half his life trying to hide from the light of justice. He screamed about his immunity, his status, his connections, but the federal agents remained completely silent as they dragged the fallen giant down the corridor in chains. Visual, the heavy iron prison gates slowly open. Bright golden morning sunlight floods the screen. Raymond Vance walks out wearing a clean civilian jacket. He stops, closes his eyes, raises his face to the sky, and draws a deep emotional breath. Fade to black. 2 months later, following an emergency federal review of the entire 2006 case file and the presentation of the recorded confession, a federal judge from an entirely different district signed the official executive order vacating Raymond Vance's conviction with immediate absolute prejudice. The state prosecutor's office issued a formal, humiliating public apology. The heavy iron gates of the state penitentiary slowly swung open, allowing a massive flood of bright golden morning sunlight to wash over the pavement. Raymond Vance stepped out into the free world for the first time in over 2 decades, wearing a simple, clean civilian jacket provided by his attorney. He didn't look back at the gray stone walls, the bars, or the concrete towers that had consumed his youth. Instead, he stopped at the edge of the prison perimeter, closed his eyes, raised his face to the warmth of the sun, and drew his very first breath of true, unblemished freedom. He looked down at his own bare hands, realizing that in the end, the law hadn't saved him because the system was perfect. System had failed him completely at every single turn. But he had survived because an ordinary man inside a tiny dark cell had been patient enough, strategic enough, and brave enough to hold on to the truth until he could turn the system's own massive, unyielding light against the monsters hiding at the very top of the mountain. Here is what I want you to sit with tonight. Pause. The cross-shaped scar on Arthur Pendelton's wrist was always there. It sat on the bench for years, signing judgments, lecturing the public on morality, hiding behind a facade of absolute institutional perfection. It was an entire life built on top of a lie, protected by a system that almost executed an innocent man just to protect its own reputation. Raymond Vance's victory is proof that no matter how deep the dark is, and no matter how heavy the gates are, truth has a way of breathing under the concrete. If this story moved you, if you believe that justice is worth fighting for even when it takes 20 long years, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It takes just 1 second, but it helps spread these stories to people who need to know they aren't alone. Share this video with someone who is fighting their own long battle, someone who is tired and feels like the system is too big to beat. Let them know the light is still coming. And make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because every single week we come back here to strip away the armor of the powerful and tell the absolute truth about what ordinary human patience is capable of. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments section down below. What do you think is the ultimate lesson of Raymond's 20-year hunt? Let me know your thoughts, because every voice matters here. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, pause, and remember, the gavel doesn't always fall the right way the first time, but some people are brave enough to pick it up again.